Tonight you're listening to The Day the Evacuation Notice Went Up, Aiko's 6 days before camp. This story follows a young Japanese-American girl in Little Tokyo in April 1942. On the morning she stops in front of a bulletin board and reads the words that begin to break her world apart. In the 6 days that follow, she watches her neighborhood shift, her home change shape, and her family gather what they can before being forced into a concentration camp. This episode is part of Stories from Camp, a long-form series of Japanese-American narratives designed to help you rest while learning the quiet, human details of life before, during, and after the camps. These stories blend documentary accuracy with soft, nighttime storytelling so you can fall asleep to history spoken gently. Settle in. Breathe. Let the story carry you. The Day the Evacuation Order Went Up. Aiko's story, April 1942. Chapter 1. Paper on the Pole. Aiko carried her father's lunch through the morning light, the warmth rising off First Street in soft waves. The sidewalk smelled faintly of oranges from the produce stalls, a scent she had known since childhood. Delivery trucks rumbled past, kicking dust into the air. The day felt ordinary enough that she moved without thinking, weaving through shopkeepers sweeping their front steps, passing the familiar rows of vegetables laid out beneath canvas awnings. She turned the corner toward San Pedro and noticed a small crowd gathered at the telephone pole ahead. People pressed close, as if someone had dropped money in the street. Mothers held their children's shoulders tight, and older men leaned forward with narrowed eyes. Aiko slowed, unsure why the group stood so still in a neighborhood always filled with movement. The edges of the crowd parted slightly, and she caught a glimpse of a pale sheet nailed high against the wood. Her pulse shifted. Notices never meant anything small. She stepped closer, the paper bright against the pole, the bold black letters climbing toward her before she reached them. She tilted her head and read the headline, "Instructions to all persons of Japanese ancestry." The words struck with a clarity that left no room for misinterpretation. She felt the weight of the bag in her hand, the glass container pressing hard against her fingers. Someone behind her whispered the date. Another voice began reading the lines aloud, halting on the phrases that controlled every movement of every family in the neighborhood. Aiko read the instructions again, slower this time, letting each sentence settle. The notice listed what they must pack, where they must report, how quickly they must leave. 6 days. The world narrowed to a short, rigid timeline built for strangers to enforce. Aiko stepped back. She watched a man shake his head and turn away, pale as chalk. A mother held a baby against her chest and tried to quiet her breathing. 2 girls from Aiko's school pressed their faces close to the notice, their hair tied with matching ribbons. Aiko recognized the look on their faces, a stunned calculation she felt inside her own ribs. For a moment the entire corner fell silent, as if the city waited to hear what they would do next. Aiko forced herself to walk away from the notice, the crowd's murmurs trailing her like a shifting wind. Her feet carried her toward the produce shop almost on instinct. First Street stretched out in its usual pattern, but the street no longer felt familiar. She moved past the storefront of the sewing shop where she once spent summer afternoons trying on fabric scraps, past the alley where she and her friends traded magazine clippings, past windows that reflected her face in small, fractured pieces. By the time she reached her father's shop, she felt the truth settle into her chest. They would leave. They would pack their life into suitcases that never held enough. The neighborhood she believed would last through every season now stood on the edge of something irreversible. She paused at the doorway, the bell above the frame giving a soft jingle as she stepped inside. Her father looked up from the crates of oranges he had been sorting. The lines around his mouth deepened as he studied her face, and she saw in his expression that he had already heard the whispers floating down the block. He didn't ask if the notice was real. He didn't need to. Aiko set the lunch on the counter. The shop smelled of earth and fruit, but underneath she sensed something new, the thin, metallic trace of fear. It clung to everything, even to the light slipping through the windows. Her father reached for a nearby crate, his hand steady, but she noticed the careful way he lifted it. He had begun measuring his movements without realizing it, preparing for a future neither of them understood. Aiko watched him sort the fruit, the motions deliberate, almost ritualistic, as if repetition could slow the world outside the door. She realized then that this morning marked the end of the life they had known. The notice had declared it plainly. And even though the shop stood unchanged, she sensed how quickly everything would shift once they stepped out of these walls. She pressed her fingers lightly against the counter, the wood warm beneath her touch. The quiet in the shop spread across her shoulders, waiting for her to speak. She took in a breath that felt heavier than the air around her. "Papa," she said softly. The word held everything she could not yet name. Chapter 2. Circles of Whispering. Aiko left the shop after lunch, the bell giving a thin ring as she stepped back into the street. The light had shifted since the morning, sharper now, as if the sun wanted to expose every corner of Little Tokyo. She carried 2 empty baskets meant for errands, though the gesture felt hollow. The neighborhood moved slower than usual, each person listening more than speaking. She walked past the dry goods store and noticed the clusters forming again. Women gathered in tight half circles outside storefronts, shawls wrapped around their arms even in the warm air. Their voices stayed low, weaving through each other like threads drawn from the same uneasy spool. One woman held a copy of the notice already folded at the creases. Another repeated a line about the reporting station, her voice wavering as if the words tasted bitter. Aiko paused beside a crate of daikon set outside Kondo's market. She didn't join any of the circles, but she heard enough to understand the fear simmering beneath the whispers. Some women asked whether families with sick children would receive extra time. Others struggled to accept that the government wanted them to leave homes tended for decades. Every few seconds, a voice dropped even lower, as if speaking too loudly might summon something worse. Her eyes met those of Mrs. Mori, who taught sewing classes in the community hall. The older woman gave her a small nod, recognition mixed with sympathy, and Aiko returned it before moving on. She didn't know what to say to anyone, words felt fragile in a place already cracked along the edges. At the corner near the drugstore, more people crowded around another posted notice. The dialogue there carried a sharper tone. A young father leaned forward, tracing a finger down the page as if hoping to find a loophole. 2 boys on bicycles circled the crowd with wide, uneasy eyes, sensing the tension without understanding the details. Aiko watched a teenage girl step back from the pole, her face strained in a way that mirrored Aiko's own reflection that morning. She continued walking, the baskets bumping lightly against her leg. Every voice she passed seemed to land on her, adding layers of expectation she never agreed to carry. Some of the younger mothers looked to her with the silent assumption that the Nisei understood these things, that the American-born children had a clearer sense of what the government intended. As if citizenship functioned like a shield. As if her birth certificate could explain any of this. Aiko slowed near the corner where the bakery stood. The staff usually kept the door propped open to let the smell of fresh anpan drift down the block, but now they kept it closed. Through the window she saw the baker's wife counting envelopes with a tired, deliberate pace. Behind her, the shelves held fewer loaves than usual, and the room echoed faintly as if the air itself had thinned. Aiko tightened her grip on the empty baskets. She realized the notices had created something new in the neighborhood, a boundary drawn not by fences but by fear. People hesitated before greeting each other. Conversations stopped mid-sentence when someone unfamiliar approached. The fabric of trust, so constant it had once seemed invisible, now showed clear strain. She turned onto a quieter street where the traffic noise softened. This part of the neighborhood usually lifted her mood, with its rows of paper lanterns strung between barber shops and noodle houses. Today the lanterns hung still, untouched by any breeze. The stillness unsettled her more than the crowds. Aiko stopped outside the store where she bought school supplies every September. Inside, the owner stood alone behind the counter, staring at a stack of notebooks as if weighing their worth. The sight struck her with unexpected force. She remembered choosing her first ink pen there, her father waiting in line behind her with patient pride. Now the memory felt distant, almost borrowed, as though it belonged to someone else's life. She started walking again. The weight of the whispers settled around her, a steady pressure against her chest. She wasn't sure whether the responsibility placed on her generation came from the adults or from something deeper inside herself. She only knew she couldn't ignore it. When she reached the end of the block, she realized she had formed a silent promise, one she hadn't intended but couldn't deny. She would carry what she needed to carry. She would stay steady for as long as she could. Behind her, the circles of whispering continued, threading through the spring air like a quiet storm gathering its strength. Chapter 3. A Father's Quiet Shop. Aiko returned to the shop in late afternoon, the air warm and thick with the scent of fruit beginning to soften in the crates. Her father stood behind the counter with his sleeves rolled to the elbows, sorting oranges into careful rows. The rhythm of his movements steadied him, but Aiko recognized the subtle tension in his shoulders. He looked like a man trying to keep order in a world that had stopped listening. She set the baskets down and stepped behind the counter to help. The shop felt half familiar, half strange. The same wooden shelves lined the walls, the same rustle of paper bags moved through the air, yet an invisible layer of uncertainty coated everything. Even the sunlight looked different, slanting across the floor as if unsure where to land. A customer entered with a hesitant shuffle. Mrs. Yamamoto, who usually chatted long enough to slow the line, kept her voice quiet. She picked through the daikin without commenting on the quality, without asking about prices, without her usual warmth. When she handed Aiko the coins, her hand trembled slightly. Aiko thanked her, but the woman only nodded and left quickly, head lowered. Her father watched the door close, his jaw tightening. "People worry," he said softly. "They don't know what to do." Aiko nodded. She didn't tell him that worry felt too small a word for what she saw in the streets that morning. Fear, confusion, resignation, those were closer to the truth. But she kept the words to herself. Her father carried enough. Another customer entered, a white man in a pressed shirt who used to stop by once a week. He walked through the aisles without meeting their eyes. When he reached the counter, he asked for potatoes, speaking with a clipped tone, the kind people used when they wanted to appear polite without engaging. Aiko's father weighed the potatoes and handed them over gently, but the man kept his distance, as if the air around them carried danger. He paid in exact change and left without looking back. The silence he left behind felt louder than his footsteps. Her father set aside the crate he had been sorting. "We should decide what to do with the rest," he said. His voice stayed calm, but Aiko heard the strain beneath it. "Sell what we can. Maybe store a little." She glanced at the stacks of produce. The shop held more than food, it held years of effort, the quiet pride of an immigrant man who built something stable in a city that never guaranteed stability. Each crate represented early mornings, late nights, and the quiet persistence that shaped their family's life. "What if no one buys?" Aiko asked. Her father hesitated. The question hung between them. He lifted an apple, turned it in his hand, then placed it down with care. "We do our best," he said. "That's all." Throughout the afternoon, more customers came. Some bowed deeply before leaving, a gesture that felt like apology. Others kept their distance, their politeness thin. Aiko moved between transactions, aware of the subtle shift in the air, the way trust seemed to dissolve with each conversation. When a young couple came in, she watched them pick only what they could carry. They bought nothing more than the bare necessities, as if they feared excess might look suspicious. They thanked her father stiffly. The woman turned away quickly, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. After they left, Aiko's father leaned against the counter. "People forget," he murmured. "We fed this neighborhood for 20 years. Aiko wanted to say something comforting, something steady. But comfort felt fragile, and steadiness felt too close to pretending. So she stepped beside him and placed a hand on the counter near his. Their fingers didn't touch, but the gesture bridged the distance. The bell above the door gave another gentle ring. More customers. More uneasy expressions. More quiet goodbyes disguised as errands. By sunset the crates looked lighter, but Aiko couldn't tell if it came from sales or from the slow dimming of the room around them. Her father wiped his hands on a cloth and gave her a tired smile, the kind of smile that carried years in its corners. "Thank you," he said. Aiko knew he didn't mean for the baskets or the sorting. He meant for standing beside him when the world shifted. For pretending they had control over what came next. For giving him someone to lean on without saying so aloud. She nodded once. Outside, the day drifted toward evening, and the neighborhood held its breath as if waiting for a storm that had already begun. Chapter 4. The Weight of Women's Work. Aiko returned home with the last traces of daylight fading across the rooftops. The apartment felt warm from the heat of the day, the air carrying the faint scent of rice cooling in the pot. She slipped off her shoes in the narrow entryway and heard her mother's quiet voice coming from the kitchen. It wasn't the usual rhythm of preparing dinner. It was the rhythm of someone trying to understand something too large and too sudden. When Aiko stepped inside, she saw her mother seated at the kitchen table with the evacuation notice spread flat beneath her palms. The edges curled slightly, as if resisting the weight placed upon them. Her mother's eyes moved slowly across the lines, tracing each instruction with careful, deliberate attention. She held her breath in that focused way she used when reading English, piecing together meaning one word at a time. Aiko set her bag down and joined her. The table held scraps of paper filled with lists: clothing, blankets, medicines, things to ask neighbors, things to store, things they might never see again. Her mother's handwriting was neat but unsteady, the loops tighter than usual. "We have 6 days," her mother said without looking up. 6. Aiko nodded. The number no longer surprised her, but hearing it aloud made it sharper. Her mother lifted the notice and tapped the section about baggage limits, her finger pausing at the line about what they could carry. "How do they expect us to pack a home into this?" she whispered. Her mother rarely questioned anything out loud. The sound unsettled Aiko more than the notice itself. She pulled a chair closer and scanned the lists. Medicine for her younger brother. Extra socks. Family photographs. A coil of thread and needles. Her mother had already begun sorting their life into categories of what could come and what must stay. Women across the neighborhood were doing the same. Aiko had watched them in the streets, shoulders hunched, hands full of papers, minds working through impossibilities with quiet endurance. She picked up the list about clothes. "I can start folding," Aiko said. She kept her voice steady, hoping to ease the tension. Her mother nodded but didn't look up. Her eyes moved back to the notice, as if searching for some hidden leniency that wasn't there. "Your father works too hard," she murmured. "He won't admit how frightened he is." Aiko understood. Men didn't show panic. They showed burden. And when burden grew too heavy, the women filled the gaps without complaint. For weeks, months even, women in Little Tokyo had done the work of 2 people while men disappeared into FBI custody or came home with shaken voices and hollow expressions. Aiko reached for the paper. "Let me read it with you." Her mother hesitated, then nodded again. They leaned together over the notice. The lamp cast a circle of warm light across the table, illuminating their faces and the creases of paper that changed the course of their lives. Aiko read the lines slowly, steadying her mother's breathing. She explained phrases that felt cold in the mouth, describing procedures without empathy. Her mother listened, absorbing each instruction like she had learned to absorb every hardship since arriving in America years ago. Aiko recognized that resilience, the kind that didn't bend so much as it softened around the edges, strengthening itself through endurance. After a long while, her mother folded the notice, smoothing each crease. "We begin tomorrow," she said. Her voice carried the tone of someone who expected no help and planned to rely on her own hands. Aiko stood and moved into the main room. Suitcases lay open on the tatami mats. Boxes waited to be filled. Her younger siblings slept in their shared room, unaware of the work ahead. The house felt suspended in an in-between state, balanced on a thin line stretched between past and future. She began gathering clothing from the drawers, folding each piece with precise movements. Her mother soon joined her, their hands working side by side. The room grew quiet except for the soft rustle of fabric and the occasional sigh from her mother's tired lungs. Aiko felt the shift happen without ceremony. Her childhood loosened its grip. she crossed into a space occupied by the women around her, a place defined by necessary work and unspoken strength. It wasn't a transformation marked by bravery or rebellion, but by acceptance, responsibility, and the certainty that she would hold her family together through the storm ahead. Late into the night, her mother paused and pressed a sweater into Aiko's hands. "You grew so quickly," she said, her voice soft. "I didn't notice until now." Aiko folded the sweater and placed it into the suitcase. She didn't respond. She didn't need to. The weight of women's work settled across her shoulders, not as a burden but as an inheritance. The night stretched on, quiet and steady, as mother and daughter prepared for the days that waited outside their door. Chapter 5. Rooms Without Time. Aiko woke before sunrise, the apartment still wrapped in that pale blue quiet that comes just before the city stirs. She sat up slowly, aware of the stiffness in her back from hours spent folding clothes on the floor the night before. For a moment she listened to the soft breathing of her younger siblings in the next room, their small, steady pulses carrying through the thin walls like a reminder of a world that still made sense to someone. She rose and moved through the hallway, each step slow, as if the apartment had grown delicate overnight. The drawers she had opened yesterday remained slightly ajar, waiting like open mouths. Boxes ringed the room in uneven stacks. Aiko crossed to the first drawer and slid it open all the way, the wood letting out a faint, familiar creak. Inside, she saw the layered pieces of her family's life, scarves, old receipts, a coin purse her mother received from a neighbor when they first arrived in Los Angeles. She lifted the purse and turned it in her hands. The fabric felt soft and worn, carrying the faint scent of cedar. She remembered her mother keeping small coins in it when Aiko was a child, always offering her 5 cents for a sweet after helping in the shop. Those were simple memories, untouched by fear, untouched by suspicion. Holding the purse now felt like touching a version of her mother she wasn't sure existed anymore. She set it aside and kept sorting. Every item she touched carried weight but never enough space. There were no instructions for how to rank memories, no guidance on what counted as essential. Practicality pushed against sentiment. Aiko lifted folded towels, linens, shirts softened by years of washing, sweaters knitted by her grandmother. Each piece carried the warmth of someone's hands. Her mother joined her quietly. She didn't speak, she simply stood beside Aiko and began emptying another drawer. Together they worked in silence, the kind of silence that felt honest, two people trying to make order out of something that refused to be ordered. Aiko paused when she reached her school blouse. The fabric had faint ink marks near the collar from the afternoon she and her best friend practiced writing characters during lunch. She held the blouse against her chest for a moment. She didn't know if she would wear it again. She didn't even know if school existed for her anymore. Her mother noticed the stillness. "Put it in the maybe pile," she said gently. Aiko nodded. She set the blouse aside. They continued through the room. Each drawer revealed another layer of their life. The kitchen cabinets held chipped bowls they used during the lean years. The hallway shelf stored the photo albums she loved flipping through on rainy afternoons. She lingered on the album longer than her mother liked. The black and white images showed her father at the shop when it first opened, her parents smiling in front of their apartment before Aiko was born, friends who had since moved away or disappeared into the chaos of the arrests. Her mother touched her arm lightly. We choose what keeps us warm, she murmured. Not what keeps us from crying. Aiko blinked, then closed the album. She placed it gently in the box marked for storage, even though she knew storage meant something uncertain, something closer to goodbye. By mid-morning, the apartment looked less like a home and more like a place between worlds. Walls still stood around them, but the rooms had lost their softness. The corners felt sharper. The space held an uneasiness that made Aiko move carefully, as if she might disturb something fragile. She knelt beside an open suitcase and folded a final set of clothes. Her movements grew slower, precise in a way that bordered on ritual. She pressed the fabric flat, smoothing it until it looked weightless. She wished the same for her own heart. Her mother stepped back and surveyed the room. "We're leaving pieces of ourselves," she said quietly. Aiko looked around. Every drawer emptied into piles of yes, no, maybe. Every object fought for relevance. The illusion of choice was cruel. They had space for almost nothing. "We're keeping enough," Aiko said. It wasn't entirely true, but the words steadied her mother's breath. She stood and stretched, her knees aching. She felt older than she had the day before, older than the girl who turned the corner and saw the notice. She wondered if everyone in the neighborhood felt the same, aged by necessity, by pressure, by the slow realization that childhood had ended in the span of a single morning. Aiko crossed the room and closed the last drawer. The sound echoed in the bare space, a small finality marking the end of something intangible. When she stepped back, she understood that this room, this home, no longer belonged to them in the way it once did. Time had shifted around them. The house hadn't changed its walls, yet everything inside it moved toward a different future, one they didn't choose. Aiko felt the truth gather beneath her sternum, heavy but clear. The home she loved was slipping into memory, and memory was the only space they could still carry without limits. Chapter 6. Packing the Unsaid. By the second day, the apartment turned into a landscape of half-filled boxes and open suitcases that never seemed to grow, no matter how carefully Aiko and her mother arranged their contents. Morning light filtered through the thin curtains in narrow bands, striping the floor in pale gold and making the dust motes drift like slow, tired snow. Aiko sat beside one of the suitcases with a stack of clothing folded to precise squares, the kind her mother always praised. Today the praise did not come. Today everything moved in silence. Her mother stood near the closet, measuring a wool coat against her own shoulders before folding it slowly, pressing the fabric flat with the weight of her palms. "It will be cold," she murmured, though she did not say when or where. They both knew the camp sat in places where desert winds or mountain frost swallowed warmth without mercy. The government didn't promise climate. It only promised barracks. Aiko reached for a blanket next. The weave felt thick under her hands, dotted with loose threads. She remembered pulling it when she was younger. She hesitated. The blanket took too much space. Her mother noticed the pause and shook her head gently. "We each take only one," she said. "Leave the others." Aiko folded the blanket anyway and placed it in the suitcase, knowing one felt impossible when she had no sense of what waited on the other side of departure. She tried again to rearrange the piles, sliding socks into corners, pressing shirts tight against the sides to create room that never appeared. The suitcase resisted every attempt at generosity. Her younger brother wandered into the room rubbing his eyes, hair sticking up at odd angles. He looked at the piles, the boxes, the tightened expressions on both their faces. "Are we going on a trip?" he asked. His voice carried the innocent curiosity of someone who had not read a notice nailed to a pole. Aiko felt her throat constrict. Before she could answer, her mother guided him back toward the hallway with a gentle pat on his back. "We're preparing," she said. "Go wash your face." The room fell silent again as soon as he left. Aiko bent over the suitcase and added her mother's sewing kit, tucking it beneath the blanket. It was small, wrapped in cotton cloth, but it carried the weight of every repair her mother had ever made to keep their clothes presentable for school, church, or interviews. Aiko felt its importance without needing to say it out loud. Some items held more than function. On the far side of the room, her mother gathered a small bundle of letters tied with twine. She touched the top envelope with her fingertips, then placed the bundle carefully in the yes pile. Aiko recognized her father's handwriting from years earlier, written during the months he worked long hours opening the shop. Her mother slid the letters into a small wooden box and closed the lid quietly, as if sealing away something too delicate for the open air. They returned to folding. Each movement felt slower now, as though they were packing not only belongings but versions of themselves they weren't ready to let go of. The sound of their work filled the room, the whisper of fabric brushing against fabric, the soft click of a box closing, the steady rhythm of their breathing as they tried to avoid sinking into thought. Aiko noticed her mother pause when she reached a small silk pouch embroidered with faded chrysanthemums. Inside it were the 2 hairpins her grandmother had given her on her wedding day. Her mother held the pouch for a long moment, her eyes distant. Then she placed it in the no pile. "Why not take it?" Aiko asked quietly. Her mother shook her head. "Too delicate," she said. "Too much to worry about." Aiko could hear what went unsaid, too much to risk losing. Too much to watch break in transit. Too much history for a place built without tenderness. The pouch returned to the floor like a fallen petal. The hours passed in that same quiet rhythm. Aiko felt the weight of every unspoken fear settle inside the room. Neither she nor her mother asked the questions circling their minds. What will the barracks look like? Will there be enough food? What if they separate us? Because the questions held no answers, only echoes. At midday her father came home briefly from the shop. He stepped into the room, surveyed the boxes, and let out a small sigh. His gaze lingered on the suitcase's half-packed interior, on the folded blanket and shirts pressed against the sides. "Good," he said. "You're doing good work." Aiko nodded, but the praise felt thin. Her father's eyes looked tired, as if he had aged a decade in a day. He squeezed her shoulder gently before returning to the shop, leaving the faint smell of oranges and dust in the doorway. When he left, Aiko sat back on her heels. The silence turned heavier than before, pressing against her ribs. Her mother lowered herself onto the tatami beside her and exhaled slowly, a long breath that marked the limit of her endurance for the day. "We may lose things," her mother said softly. "We don't lose who we are." Aiko looked at the open suitcase, at the uneven stacks of their life squeezed into corners. She didn't know if her mother's promise held truth or hope. She only knew she wanted to believe it. The late afternoon light slipped across the floor as they returned to their work. The room felt changed, stripped of softness, rearranged into something temporary. Aiko moved a shirt into place, smoothing the fabric with both hands. No one said it aloud, but they both felt it. The house had begun letting go of them long before they finished letting go of it. Chapter 7. Shifting Borders of Home. By the third morning, Aiko stepped outside to catch her breath, but even the street felt smaller than it had 2 days earlier. The spring air held a faint sweetness from the persimmon trees, yet beneath it she sensed a tension that pinched at the edges of every familiar sound. Cars idled with less patience. Conversations cut short as she approached. The borders of her neighborhood, once defined by warmth and routine, shifted with every step she took. She walked toward the shop to check on her father, her shoes tapping gently against the uneven pavement. Usually First Street carried the hum of vendors setting up displays, radios drifting from windows, laughter passing between doorways. Today the sounds felt muffled, as if a thin layer of dust had settled over everything. Aiko saw neighbors she had known since childhood, but their faces looked different. Some offered small nods, tight smiles that never reached their eyes. Others lowered their gaze, as though meeting hers might burden them with a truth they didn't want to hold. Outside the grocer's, Mrs. Nishida stood with her hands clasped around a woven basket. She had been warm and lively before, quick to call Aiko dear girl and slip her rice crackers wrapped in wax paper. Today she greeted Aiko with a subdued bow, her voice thin. "Your mother must be working hard," she said quietly. Aiko nodded. "We all are." The older woman held her gaze for a moment before looking away, her movements cautious, her expression clouded with the kind of fear people tried to swallow but couldn't hide. A pair of white customers crossed the street as Aiko approached the shop, moving as though drawn by some instinct to create distance. Their avoidance felt subtle yet unmistakable. She watched the couple glance back once, then turned sharply down another block. Aiko didn't know whether she felt anger or resignation. Both emotions rested inside her like two sides of the same coin. She entered the shop. Her father gave her a tired smile and said the business had slowed even further. The crates of produce stood fuller than they should at this hour, the oranges still bright, the greens still crisp. The emptiness unsettled her. Her father tried to remain proud, keeping the displays tidy, but the silence between customers told its own story. Aiko helped him rearrange items, though both knew it wouldn't change anything. The neighborhood was contracting around them, drawing invisible lines of caution. After a while she stepped back outside, letting the door close behind her. She walked past the small shrine on the corner where people once gathered for festivals. The paint on the gate still shone red in the sunlight, but the space held no children playing today. Instead, the shrine looked like a memory, something beloved yet set apart, no longer woven into the everyday rhythm of the street. Farther down the block, Aiko spotted her best friend Yuki standing beneath the awning of her family's store. Yuki's hands rested on the wooden railing, knuckles pale. When she saw Aiko, she smiled, though the expression looked thin. They stood together in the shade, letting the silence stretch between them. Words felt too fragile to rely on. After a long moment, Yuki said, "Everything feels different." Aiko nodded. "Yes." Yuki looked out toward the street. "I keep thinking someone will say this is a mistake. That we're reading it wrong. That someone will come fix it." The wish sounded childish, but Aiko heard the truth beneath it. They both wanted the world to stay the size it had been before the notice appeared. Neither knew how to return to that version of life. Aiko walked home as the afternoon light softened. She noticed small details she had never paid attention to before: the uneven brickwork beneath her feet, the way clothes swayed on laundry lines between buildings, the crack in the curb shaped like a small river. Each detail felt like a goodbye she hadn't prepared for. She understood the neighborhood had begun separating itself from her, not because of anything she had done, but because fear had redrawn its boundaries. When she reached her apartment steps, she paused and looked back at First Street. She saw the place where she grew up, the place she thought would always feel like hers. But the borders had shifted, folding in on themselves, leaving her on the outside even while she still walked its paths. The home she knew stood behind her. The world ahead waited with no promises. Aiko stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. Chapter 8: The Streets at Dusk. Dusk settled over Little Tokyo with a softness that almost fooled Aiko into believing the day held some mercy. The sky shifted into muted shades of lavender and pale gold, bathing the rooftops in a gentle glow that reminded her of summers before the war, when evenings meant laughter drifting from open windows and the smell of grilled fish rising from family kitchens. Tonight the air carried a quieter weight. The familiar sounds thinned, as if the neighborhood exhaled with hesitation. Aiko stepped outside with a small bundle of errands, more for the ritual of movement than necessity. She walked along First Street, her steps slow, trying to map each detail of the place into memory. Lanterns hung above the walkway, swaying only slightly in the cooling air. Light from the noodle shop spilled onto the sidewalk in a narrow strip, but the usual chatter inside had softened to murmurs. Aiko paused at the window, watching a handful of diners eat with their heads lowered, as though the notice had cast a shadow even over meals. A few doors down, she reached the corner where she and Yuki used to linger after school, trading stories about teachers and secret hopes. The bench still stood beneath the awning, its wooden slats worn smooth by years of passing bodies. Aiko sat for a moment, letting her fingers trace the grooves. She remembered laughing here until her stomach ached, remembered the warmth of carefree afternoons. Now the bench felt like an artifact, still present but unearthed from a time that no longer fit. As dusk deepened, the street lamps flickered on. Their yellow glow blurred against the edges of storefront signs, creating halos that softened everything. Aiko found herself watching the lamplight more closely than usual, memorizing how it reflected in the windows of the dry cleaners, how it pulled at the base of the telephone pole where the notice still hung. Even the shadows felt important now, as though they told her quiet stories about the parts of the neighborhood she hadn't appreciated enough. She continued down the block toward the corner shop where she once bought ink pens for school. The window display looked unchanged: stacks of notebooks, small bottles of glue, rows of pencils sharpened to perfect points. But the store was closed early. A handwritten sign taped to the door read, "Sorry. Preparing." Aiko understood the message immediately. Everyone had begun counting their own days, their own piles, their own fears. A few steps away, she passed the small music store where she used to linger to listen to records. Aiko had once stood outside with a boy from school, pretending not to care when he teased her about her taste in songs. She smiled at the memory, the faint flutter it stirred, but the smile faded quickly. She didn't know if he had already been relocated or if his family was packing in silence like hers. The thought left her with a hollow ache that sat behind her ribs. A child's laughter drifted from an alley nearby, high and bright for a single moment. Aiko turned toward the sound, catching sight of two young siblings chasing each other between parked cars, unaware of the weight adults carried. Their mother stood nearby with tired eyes, watching closely. The children's laughter faded as quickly as it came, swallowed by the quiet night. Aiko walked farther, letting the streets guide her like they always had. She reached the spot where the shopkeepers gathered each morning to sweep the sidewalks. The brooms leaned against the wall now, unused. Even the dust seemed to settle differently, less stubborn, more resigned. She knelt for a moment and pressed her fingertips to the pavement, feeling the warmth the sun had left behind. It felt like touching a memory already slipping from her hands. At the end of the block, she turned toward the alley behind her building. Aiko moved slowly, allowing the dimming light to wrap around her. She inhaled the shy scent of evening, baking bread, drying laundry, the faint bitterness of someone simmering tea at a window. These smells had shaped her childhood. Now they felt like a final chorus before an unfamiliar silence. She reached the narrow stairwell leading up to her family's apartment. The fire escape groaned softly under her weight as she climbed. When she reached the landing, she paused and faced the city. The rooftops stretched before her in dusky blues and warm lights beginning to glow. She had watched this view countless times without thinking. Tonight she let it sink into her bones. The city felt unchanged. Yet she knew it was already turning away, already preparing to move on without them. The realization didn't feel sharp, it felt slow and deep, like water pulling at her ankles. Aiko wrapped her arms around herself and took one long breath. She let the dusk settle into her memory, willing herself to remember the colors, the smells, the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood at this fragile hour. Then she turned and stepped through the window into the apartment, leaving the streets behind her for the night, carrying their fading warmth inside her chest. Chapter 9: The Argument in the Kitchen. By the next evening the apartment felt tighter, as though every packed box pushed the walls inward. Aiko moved between the kitchen and the main room with a stack of folded towels, trying to keep herself busy, but tension crept into the air long before the sun slipped behind the buildings. Her father returned from the shop earlier than usual. He hung his coat on the hook with an unfamiliar stiffness, his silence settling into the room like dust that refused to be swept away. Her mother stood at the kitchen counter sorting through a pile of household items that never seemed to shrink. The soft clink of ceramic against wood echoed through the apartment. Aiko sensed the shift before the first words formed. There was a heaviness in the air that no amount of careful folding could smooth out. Her father stepped into the kitchen. "We should store the good dishes," he said. "The neighbors said they'll watch the building. It will be fine." Her mother didn't look up. "Nothing is fine," she replied quietly, as though speaking to herself. "You think they will guard these things as if they were their own? You think they have time for that?" Her father's jaw tightened. "We cannot carry everything." Her mother stopped sorting and turned to face him. Her eyes were tired, but a sharp clarity lived beneath the exhaustion. "I know what we cannot carry," she said. "I am deciding what we can risk losing." The words hung between them, more brittle than either intended. Aiko stood at the threshold with the towels clutched in her hands. She didn't want to interrupt, but she didn't want to leave either. They hadn't argued like this in years. Her father's voice stayed measured, but frustration threaded through it. "If we leave too much behind, we will have nothing when we return," he said. "When?" her mother asked softly. "You speak as if someone promised it." Her father's breath caught. The question cracked something open inside him, something he wanted to hide behind routine and forced composure. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "We will return," he said. "We must." Her mother shook her head, turning the small ceramic bowl in her hands. "They took my brother," she whispered. "Without reason. Without a word. You tell me why I should trust anything now." Aiko felt her chest tighten. She knew her mother rarely spoke of her brother, arrested weeks ago along with other East Say men. She kept that pain folded neatly inside her, a private sorrow she never asked her family to carry. Hearing her voice, it now filled the room with a quiet ache. Her father reached for the bowl. "I am trying," he said. "We must stay hopeful." Hope sounded fragile on his tongue, a thin thread stretched too tight. Her mother exhaled, long and tired. "Hope doesn't pack boxes," she said. "Hope doesn't guard our things. Hope doesn't keep us warm in a place we haven't seen." She put the bowl down gently, as if afraid it might break under the weight of her words. Aiko stepped forward and placed the towels on the counter. The small movement interrupted the rising tension. Her parents turned toward her at the same time, each wearing different versions of strain on their faces. Her mother's shoulders softened slightly. Her father looked apologetic, as if he wished he could smooth the room with one steady gesture. Aiko reached for the bowl and wrapped it carefully in cloth before placing it into a box. Neither parent spoke. They watched as she tied the string around it with slow, deliberate movements. Her hands steadied themselves even as her heart thudded in her chest. Her mother touched Aiko's arm. "You shouldn't hear us like this," she said. Aiko shook her head. "I live here too," she replied. The words surprised her, gentle but firm. She felt them settle the room, not with dominance but with truth. Her father let out a quiet breath. "We are all afraid," he said. "Just in different ways." His voice held sincerity, stripped clean of the stubborn pride he sometimes carried. Her mother met his eyes for the first time since the argument began. The silence between them changed shape, not resolved, but softened. Aiko could see it clearly now. Her father clung to hope because the alternative felt unbearable. Her mother prepared for loss because she had already lived through it once. Their conflict wasn't about objects or boxes. It was about how each tried to protect the family in the only way they knew. As night settled outside, the three of them finished packing together. No one mentioned the argument again. They didn't need to. The kitchen felt warmer now, lit by the small lamp that cast a steady glow over their hands as they worked side by side. The storm inside the house had quieted, leaving a sense of fragile unity in its wake. Aiko felt it settle around her, gentle, imperfect, real. A family holding on through a moment that asked too much of all of them. When she carried the last box to the corner of the room, she realized something had shifted inside her as well. She had stepped into a space between her parents, translating their fears without speaking them aloud. It wasn't a role she asked for, but it belonged to her now. and she intended to carry it with as much grace as she could. Chapter 10: Quiet Resolve. Night settled over the apartment with a stillness that felt deeper than silence. The argument had faded into memory, leaving behind a thin, tender quiet. Aiko stepped into her room and closed the door softly, though the hinges still gave their usual sigh. Moonlight filtered through the curtains in a faint silver line, falling across the half-packed suitcase waiting near her bed. She sank to the tatami beside it, exhaling a breath she had been holding since morning. The suitcase lay open like a question she hadn't yet answered. Clothing folded in neat stacks filled half of it. Beneath the layers sat the essentials: comb, handkerchiefs, socks tucked into the corners for efficiency. Everything practical. Everything chosen with care. Still, the suitcase felt incomplete, as though something meaningful remained unspoken. Aiko reached for her scarf hanging on the peg near the window. It was a soft blue cotton with small white flowers stitched along the edges. Her mother had sewn it for her last winter, when the cold snapped sharper than usual. Aiko wrapped it around her shoulders now, letting the fabric settle against her skin. It felt grounding, simple, warm, familiar. She folded the scarf slowly, pressing her fingers along the crease, smoothing it with a tenderness she rarely allowed herself. The motion steadied her thoughts. She felt the lingering heaviness from the day, the whispered fears in the market, her father's worn expression, her mother's quiet tremble when she thought no one watched. All of it rested in her chest like a knot that refused to loosen. Aiko set the scarf into the suitcase, fitting it between the folded sweaters. The moment the fabric touched the others, something shifted inside her, a small, quiet resolve that rose from someplace deeper than fear. She didn't know what the camp would be like. She didn't know what systems would greet them or how much comfort they would find there. But she sensed that she needed to carry this piece of herself into that unknown space, something soft enough to remind her of home, something chosen deliberately rather than forced. Her eyes drifted to the small wooden box on her nightstand, the one where she kept the letters from her school friends, old ticket stubs, paper cranes from festivals. She opened it gently. Inside lay fragments of the life she still claimed, each item holding a memory that helped shape her. She took out a single paper crane and held it between her fingers. The crisp fold along the wings caught the light. This crane had been given to her by a boy in her class, during a week when both of them stayed late helping decorate for an assembly. The memory surfaced with tenderness, not romantic, not dramatic, just warm. She traced the edge of the wing and felt a small ache. She wondered if he would think of her after she was gone. She wondered if he had his own crane tucked away somewhere too. Aiko placed the crane inside her scarf, hiding it between the folds like a quiet secret. She closed the suitcase halfway and sat back, resting her palms against the cool tatami. She listened to the faint hum of the city outside, the distant buzz of a streetcar, the soft murmur of someone's radio playing far off, the creak of floorboards as neighbors moved about their own hurried tasks. These sounds had always been part of her life. Now each one felt like a goodbye she hadn't asked for. Yet beneath the sorrow, she felt a growing clarity. She had spent the last days balancing her mother's caution and her father's hope, holding steady for her siblings, absorbing the uncertainty across the neighborhood. She had done it quietly, without ceremony. Tonight she understood that none of it diminished her. It shaped her. She didn't know how she would hold herself in the camp, whether she would feel brave or angry or simply tired. But she knew she would enter as someone who could bend without breaking. Someone who could care for others without losing her own center. Someone who could make space for fear and still move forward. Aiko reached for the suitcase and pressed the lid down gently, not locking it yet, just signaling completion for the night. She brushed her fingertips across its surface, tracing the worn fabric, letting the gesture settle her mind. The moonlight glinted against the metal clasp. The room felt calmer now. She felt calmer now. She stood, stretched her stiff shoulders, and moved toward the door. She paused with her hand on the frame, sensing the stillness around her, feeling the quiet resolve settle deeper. She was not ready for what waited ahead, but readiness was not the point. She would go, and she would endure, and she would remain herself. And that, she decided, would be enough. Chapter 11, Night before the 6 days begin. The apartment breathed in a different rhythm that night, as if every room held its own quiet worry. Aiko lay awake on her futon, listening to the gentle rise and fall of the city outside. A streetcar rattled in the distance, its wheels humming along their familiar metal lines. Someone's radio drifted through an open window 2 buildings away, the melody soft and wavering. These sounds had always lulled her to sleep. Tonight they felt like echoes of a world she was drifting away from. She turned onto her side and looked toward the hallway. A dim stripe of light, yellow and thin, spilled beneath the door. Her mother was still awake. Aiko could hear her moving back and forth in the kitchen, checking lists she had checked many times already. Every few minutes a drawer slid open, then closed with a gentle click. Her mother had always found comfort in motion. She pressed order into chaos with her hands. Tonight she pressed order into fear. Aiko sat up quietly and pulled her knees to her chest. The apartment smelled faintly of the stew her mother reheated for dinner, mixed with the dusty scent of boxes stacked along the walls. Shadows pooled in the corners of the room. They made everything feel temporary, as if the walls themselves had loosened their attachment to the family inside. She imagined the house watching them prepare to leave, holding its breath. From the living room she heard the soft rustle of her father settling onto the floor, bedding brushing against the tatami. He had come home later than usual, carrying the exhaustion of the shop on his shoulders. He had said little during dinner, beyond a few reassurances spoken in a quiet voice. Aiko sensed he carried his hope like a fragile object he didn't want to drop. She wished she could ease his burden, but she had already taken on so much from both sides. Her younger siblings slept deeply in their room, unaware of the urgency gathering around them. Their soft snores reminded Aiko of childhood nights when she would sneak into their room and tell stories in whispers to comfort them during storms. She wondered if there were words strong enough to comfort them in the days ahead. She doubted any existed. Aiko rose and walked to the window. She drew the curtain aside and looked out at the patchwork of rooftops. The lights across the neighborhood glimmered like scattered fireflies, growing dimmer as shops closed for the night. She recognized the glow from the bakery, the faint sparkle from the drugstore sign, the flicker from the small shrine lantern. All these places had shaped her days, her seasons, her understanding of who she was. The night breeze moved through the opening with a soft chill. Aiko rested her hands on the window frame and took a slow, steady breath. She felt something shift inside her, not with drama but with a sense of inevitability. She stood on the threshold of the 6 days ahead, knowing she would bear their weight. She would translate documents. She would calm her siblings. She would steady her mother when her voice trembled. She would help her father pack the remnants of the shop into crates that would never return to their shelves. Responsibility had chosen her long before she chose it. She closed the window gently and stepped back into the dark room. The apartment felt fragile now, like a shell they would soon shed. Aiko lay down again, letting her cheek rest against the soft cotton of her pillow. She listened closely to the hum of the city, holding on to each familiar sound with deliberate care. The night wrapped around her in a thin veil, neither comforting nor cruel. Just honest. Before sleep drifted in, she understood something she hadn't realized until now. She had crossed into a new chapter of herself. Not because she wanted to, but because the world had demanded it of her. She felt older. Not grown up in the way she once imagined it, marriages, jobs, travel, but in the way grief and responsibility carve adulthood into a person long before they are ready. In the dim quiet, Aiko's breath steadied. She didn't have answers. She didn't have certainty. But she carried an inner steadiness that did not belong to the girl she had been last week. She closed her eyes. The 6 days waited on the other side of morning. And she would meet them. Chapter 12, The First Step Toward Departure. Before dawn, the apartment glowed in a soft gray that blurred the edges of every box and suitcase. Aiko woke to the faint clatter of her mother tying string around a stack of neatly folded blankets. The sound was gentle but carried an urgency that nudged her fully awake. She rose quietly and stepped into the hallway, the floor cool beneath her feet, the faint chill of early morning settling into her skin. Her mother stood at the kitchen table, fingers moving with practiced precision. The lamplight created a small island of warmth around her, illuminating the lines of fatigue etched along her face. She looked up when Aiko approached. There was no need for words. They had moved beyond explanations. They worked. Aiko walked to the bundles waiting beside the table and picked up one of the half-packed boxes. Its weight pressed into her arms, familiar and grounding. She moved it to the door, setting it down beside the others, stacks of practical items, wrapped ceramics, shoes tied together by their laces, blankets rolled tight. Each box held something they had chosen to carry forward, and something they had been forced to leave behind. Her father entered the room moments later, fastening the last button on his shirt. His eyes looked hollow from too little sleep, but he offered them a small, steady nod. He didn't speak either. He simply stepped in beside them and tied one final knot on the last box, his hands moving slowly as if memorizing the gesture. Aiko's younger brother wandered in half asleep, rubbing his eyes. Her mother brushed his hair gently from his forehead and told him to wash up. The day would demand more from him than he understood. The scent of miso simmering on the stove rose through the kitchen, simple, comforting, almost out of place. Aiko poured small bowls for the family, handing them out with careful movements. They ate in silence, each spoonful grounding them in the present. Her father paused once, looking at the table with an expression that suggested he was imprinting it into memory, the place they had shared breakfasts, late-night meals, whispered talks after long workdays. When the meal ended, Aiko washed the bowls and set them upside down on the towel. She knew her mother intended to leave them behind. The thought pressed against her chest, yet she dried each bowl with steady hands. The sky began to lighten outside the window. A thin line of rose-colored light formed along the horizon. Aiko stepped onto the fire escape, breathing in the cool dawn air. The city looked calm from this height, quiet streets, shuttered shops, roofs catching the first hints of morning. She held the moment for a long breath, then another, letting the cool wind anchor her. This was her home. These streets, these lights, these rooftops. They belonged to her. No notice, no deadline, no forced departure could rewrite that truth. The city might move on without them, but she would carry it. Every corner, every scent, every sound had shaped her. And she would bring those pieces with her because they lived inside her now as surely as her own heartbeat. She stepped back inside. Her mother tied the final knot on a bundle of linens. Her father lifted 2 suitcases, the handles worn smooth from years of use. The apartment, once full of laughter, meals, noise, rhythm, stood quiet and bare now. The echoes of their life lingered in the corners, but the rooms had already begun giving themselves back to emptiness. Aiko picked up her own suitcase. The weight felt real and solid, but not unbearable. Inside lay the items she had chosen, some for survival, some for memory, some for reasons she couldn't explain even to herself. She stood in the doorway with her family, the early light filtering around them. Her mother locked the door gently, lingering with her hand on the frame. Her father touched her shoulder. Aiko stepped forward, her suitcase in hand, feeling a calmness settle inside her, not confidence, not certainty, but readiness. A quiet authority she had claimed over the last few days, shaped not by power but by endurance and clarity. The 6 days had begun. Aiko took the first step down the staircase. The morning air shifted around her, cool and bright, carrying the faint scent of rice from a neighboring kitchen. She lifted her chin and walked toward the street where the trucks would eventually arrive. Whatever waited ahead, she would meet it with steady hands. And she would remain herself. Thank you for listening to The Day the Evacuation Notice Went Up. This episode is part of Stories from Camp, a continuing series of Japanese-American narratives told as quiet, nighttime historical dramas. If you'd like to hear more, you can explore the rest of the library on our channel. And if you're a storyteller or creator who wants to collaborate with us, you can reach out anytime at redressradio.com.